Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a new weekly podcast shining a spotlight on Australian fiction. My name is Claudine Tinellis. As a writer and avid reader, I love chatting about books. And in this podcast, I'll chat to authors, publishers and readers, giving you, dear listener, insight into what's hot on the Australian fiction scene. So if you're looking for your next book recommendation or just want to know more about Aussie fiction writers, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and enjoy. Regular listeners of the podcast will know that I am quite partial to crime fiction in all its forms: thriller, psychological suspense, a whodunit, and domestic noir, amongst others. So I always get a thrill to discover new crime fiction writers. Talented authors like Greg Woodland, Ray Cairns, Kelly Hawkins, R.W.R. MacDonald, Anna Downs, and Amy Suter Clark are amongst some of the new authors I've had the pleasure of discovering through this podcast. And today I can add another name to this burgeoning list of homegrown talent. Tim Ayliffe is a Sydney-based author and journalist who is the managing editor of television and video for ABC News. Before joining the ABC, he travelled the world and worked in London for British Sky News. A few years ago, he decided to try his hand at novel writing and has now penned 3 novels featuring former foreign correspondent John Bailey. First came The Greater Good, second State of Fear, and shortly another gripping John Bailey instalment will hit shelves across Australia. The novel is called The Enemy Within, and I'm super excited to welcome Tim to the podcast today. Hey, Tim.
Hey, Claudine. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. Congratulations on another exciting novel to add to your list of achievements. Are you excited by its impending release?
Yeah, I can't wait. This one, it's taken me a couple of years, and I feel that, I'm really growing as a writer, and I really enjoyed this one. Once it got going, it actually came out quite quickly. I really enjoyed writing it, and the John Bailey character for me now is a lot of longevity, I think, in him. I really enjoy writing it.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I absolutely loved it. I raced through it. It was gripping, chilling, and served, I thought, to highlight the sinister underbelly of growing global discontent. There's so much in this book, it's hard to know where to start with this chat, really. But I wondered if perhaps we could start with your inspiration for your character, John Bailey.
So look, everything in my books either has happened, will happen, or could happen. Of course, they're works of fiction, but having that as the sort of mantra in which that I, come up with the stories for the plots for the books. I needed a character to take readers on that journey, and John Bailey is an amalgam of so many people that I've worked with, some of my experiences too. Over the sort of couple of decades that I've been working as a journalist, both here and overseas. So he's not really based on anyone in particular, but he's as I said, he's a sort of amalgam of lots of different people. Yeah, I find that, he shares a lot of the traits of, cops and, lawyers and, journalists. They all are private investigators. They've all share this sort of similar DNA in that they're chasing down some kind of truth. And for me to be able to tell that sort of thriller story, I went for the journalist because it's a world that I've known so well.
Indeed. Now, I haven't read your first 2 novels, but the wonderful thing about The Enemy Within is that it's easily read as a standalone. It's a book set in Sydney, almost in my own backyard, really, and it certainly made me think about the city of my birth or the suburbs that I grew up in a completely different way. And specifically, it made me think that, terrible things can happen anywhere and everywhere. So I wanted to ask you, did you consciously want to set this story in Sydney?
Yeah, I did. Sydney's is a great place. It's full of contradictions. It's a great character setting. My first 2 books are mostly set in Sydney as well. There aren't a lot of sort of crime thriller books that are set in Sydney. Surprisingly, there's been some great ones over the years. There's some really good at the moment books about rural Australian noir that sort of been a bit of a thing, but I wasn't really interested in doing that. I think enough people are doing that. I really wanted to set something in Sydney. I mean, Sydney's is an international city. It's got a fascinating population, and the demographics here got the sort of very affluent eastern suburbs areas with old money, and the northern beaches, which is very much an Anglo sort of area, and then you go into parts of the inner west, and in Western Sydney you've got the sort of the new migrant populations, from the Middle East, for example, from a lot of Asian countries as well, where you've got this real sort of multicultural melting pot. And with that and a big sort of international city in itself in the CBD, just for me, it's just such a great character and a great place to set a crime thriller.
Okay, so before we get chatting too deeply about the book, I wondered if you could tell listeners who haven't read it yet what this story is all about.
Yeah, so look, to get to what the story's about, I'll probably talk a little bit about the things that inspired me to write it. And there's two main things there. The first of which is in June 2019, a bunch of Australian Federal Police officers entered my workplace and raided the ABC, and they were chasing the source for a story that a couple of great ABC journos, Sam Clark and Dan Oakes, had written about alleged human rights abuses by Australian soldiers in Afghanistan. And the warrant that was used to raid the ABC that day had this incredibly powerful, worrying, I should say, power in it, which said that the AFP officers had the power to add, copy, delete, and alter the ABC's files in the course of their search investigation in the building. That really worried me deeply and just led me to think that what would happen if that power got into the wrong hand. I'm not for a second suggesting that we've got corrupt AFP officers out there, but it did just lead me to think. I mean, this is extraordinary that a police officer could come in and change, alter, delete files associated with a story that they're looking for the source for in the course of their investigation. That was really worrying. So that's the one thing. The second thing was the rise of far right nationalism that we're seeing sort of spread across the world at the moment. We've got far right nationalist leaders in half a dozen countries right now. And I think the world at the moment, we're seeing extremism sort of rise up in many different ways. For a while there, it was Islamic extremism. And I actually tackled that issue in my second book, State of Fear. More recently, we're seeing this sort of white supremacist extremists sort of pop up. And there really is a worrying sort of interconnected global kind of movement here where even though they may seem small in number, they're very well connected right across the world. So with social media, which I talk a little bit about in the book as well, these people are connecting with each other. So they're sitting in, little dark rooms in wherever they're sitting, Western Sydney, for instance, and connecting with someone in the United States that holds similar views. So these people that felt that they just, were a minority and that there weren't, many others like them. Social media is connecting these people up all around the world and making them feel like they're part of something bigger. It's not that there is a huge amount of these people, but the fact that they are there and I guess egging each other on makes them feel like there's something part of something much bigger. And the result of that is some of the violent attacks that we've seen in the United States, New Zealand, Norway, in recent years. And that really worried me. So, and I thought that was an interesting issue to explore. So with, this third John Bailey thriller, I've sort of coupled those two plot lines, together. And the book begins with John Bailey, who's working for his new magazine as an investigative reporter, going along to a speech by a kind of populist American who's a darling of the far right. He's giving a speech in Sydney, and Bailey goes along to check out the crowd, really, and he's trying to do a bit of a profile on this guy. And in going there, he sort of bumps into the white supremacist movement that's alive and kicking in Sydney, and falling into that world pretty quickly as he starts his investigation.
You deal with some super topical themes in this book, not the least of which is that, as you said, the rise of that white supremacy movement, but racism and race wars and police corruption. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. I want to just touch on something that you said a little while back about social media. And I think it's fair to say that in this book, you've taken a swipe at social media as well as media barons who have the ability to control the narrative on issues of concern to the public. So I wanted to ask you, do you despair for the fate of quality journalism in light of this?
Look, I did for a while, and I still think it's a big problem. I think the social media is very much the wild west of information sharing through social media. You don't need to necessarily go looking for facts. You can go looking for people that may hold an opinion that is similar to yours. And the more people that you can find, you think of the anti-vaxxer movement for as an example, the more people that you can find with a similar opinion as yours probably emboldens you to think that actually what you're discovering is people that are helping to support your opinion as fact, and that is a real problem. I do think that obviously the whole fake news issue we saw, particularly through the years of the Trump presidency, was sort of brought to the fore. The way Russian hackers and others have been involved in pushing fake news is an issue. I think the social media companies are now starting to accept that they have a responsibility here, that they are not just, there for people to share things, but, social media is what the name it suggests, media. I mean, you don't have a newspaper or television network that's broadcasting news programs or responsible mastheads and television channels that don't have their own kind of editorial policies around what is actually okay, as in we should be reporting the truth, we should have factual reporting out there. So I think the pandemic has actually probably brought these things to the fore as much as maybe, Donald Trump's presidency has too, that it's made people actually start to think about where they get their information and wanting to go to sources and listen to people that actually do know what they're talking about rather than just having opinions about things.
Now, John Bailey is not the only fictional journalist who plays a fundamental role in the pursuit of criminals through his investigative journalism. Chris Hammer's Martin Scarsden is another notable example in recent times. So I wanted to ask, how important a role do you think investigative journalists play in exposing criminal activity in real life?
Incredibly important. I mean, if you look at, the Royal Commission into the abuse of children by institution, that was, brought about following the incredible work by a Newcastle Herald journalist, some great journalists at the ABC and at Fairfax that exposed effectively a mass cover-up for a long time by a lot of institutions. You look at the Royal Commission into aged care. I mean, that was the result of the pressure that started to build after a fantastic and somewhat disturbing but incredible reporting, from an ABC journalist for Four Corners. So I think that journalists and investigative journalists, having the time and the resources to really dig into some issues is really important. And I do think a very strong and independent media is crucial, and that's why Scarsden with Chris Hammer's fantastic books is a great character, and he's a bit of a dogged journalist on the trail as well, just like John Bailey is, and these people are real. I mean, they are based on people who are real experiences that both Chris and I have had over the years, and some of the people we've worked with. And investigative journalism is just one tool of looking for the truth. We've got police and others that are tirelessly doing their jobs, but journalists can often help along the way.
One of the things I found fascinating in this book, Tim, was your commentary on terrorism and whether it's different from fundamentalism or other extremism. You've spoken a little bit about it already, but it touched on a topic that can be quite sensitive in Australia, I think, things that can encompass racial profiling and the often unfair assumption that people who look a certain way, who live in certain areas, or who have a certain background are more prone to be fundamentalists. But your book challenges this perception on many levels. Was this conscious on your part?
Extremists, don't step out of their home, wanting to kill people on day one. It's often a path that's taken by people that are, sometimes or somewhat vulnerable. So if you think about people, whether they've been, marginalised because of the colour of their skin or because of their, the areas they're brought up in, or the fact that they may be, struggling financially, that gulf between rich and poor, I think is definitely an issue as well. I do think that extremism and terrorism, particularly, I would add. I mean, they often do target, people that are vulnerable to join their causes, and I think that they're also, these people that are, incredibly ideological, and I do, quote from some real life figures in the book, white supremacists that have inspired others, that these people, they do go looking for people that are feeling lost and looking for something. And I think that's where we've seen through social media and the dark web, particularly some people being recruited to a cause.
Another thing that I loved about this book, Tim, was the pace. It was fast moving with, incredible rising tension, everything a good thriller should have in spades. I wondered if you thought your experience as a journalist helped you with this aspect of your writing.
I don't know if it's my experience as a journalist. Maybe it's my experience as a reader. I want to thoroughly entertain the reader. I want them to pick up the book and not want to put it down. I want them to keep turning the pages, and not want to get off a plane or not want to get off the bus that they're traveling on while they're reading. So, look, it's really important for me that, I do tackle some pretty serious, issues. And as I said earlier, around setting this in sort of real world environments is important for me. But, first and foremost, I want people to enjoy this book. So for me, the characters that I bring, through the story, whether it's, Annie Brooks, who's the sort of somewhat prior love interest of Bailey, and there's still a bit of a tension there, and she's a big character in this book as well, or Ronnie Johnson, my CIA agent, who pops up in Bailey's books. I mean, I want to have big characters that are interesting and entertaining for the reader as well. So that pace is really important for me, really important. And I work hard at it. I make sure that there are things, happening enough in the book to really sustain a ripping story.
Yeah, fantastic. So, Tim, what would you like readers to take away most from this novel, other than enjoyment, of course?
Look, enjoyment's, number one. I want them to enjoy the book. But I also think that the way that I tend to write, I do want them to feel like, that they've got maybe a better understanding of, a couple of, big issues in this book. And, one of them being abuse of power, how power can be abused, and also extremism and how it's sort of become a bit of a drumbeat of our daily lives. So that's probably the two things. But, particularly I think around extremism and how people are often recruited to things, and sometimes it doesn't take much. Or I want people to get a better understanding of those issues.
Yeah, well, I think you certainly do shine a light on those issues in a very insightful way. So, thank you for that.
I think just adding to that, I think really good crime fiction and crime thrillers, they actually do that. They do shine lights into dark places and tell us some of the sort of truths around our world that we don't hear about a lot, or we don't understand them. And I find with fiction, then I read a lot of non-fiction too, and obviously my day job is being a journalist and running a news channel. That factual reporting is really important to me. But I do think that with fiction, you can get really close to the truth on things in a way that you can't with non-fiction sometimes. So just to expand on that idea a bit, it's if you're creating a story set inside the real world, to really explore the issues that I'm interested in exploring in a way that is pacey and entertaining with some interesting characters, then you can actually give someone a thorough understanding of the issues you're trying to explore, if you know what I mean by that.
So, speaking of your day job, Tim, have a full time job, you have a family. So, I wanted to know how you manage to find time to write books.
Because I love it. For starters, if you want to, be a writer, you've got to really love doing it. It can't be a chore for you because you just wouldn't get the words down. So for me, I tend to write on weekends. I get up at sort of 5:30, and I'll write for 3 hours on a Saturday before I take the kids to their sport, rugby and netball, which is favourite time of the week, to be honest, watching the kids play sport. And then on Sundays I'll do the same. I'll get up at 5:30 and write maybe for a little bit longer. I might get 4 or 5 hours in on a Sunday. So you make sacrifices to be able to do that. I've got an incredibly supportive wife who also has a busy job too. So I just try to remove the writing as much as possible from our family life, so that I can keep chipping away at it. So early mornings on weekends, and look, during the week I don't really write at all because I'm up pretty early for work and needing to be really my head buried in the news to be able to do my day job properly. So I just sort of accept that, and that's fine. And I actually love my day job anyway. I love working where I work, and the ABC. I'm lucky to have my job, and I mean, particularly you reflect on that during this pandemic, and we're talking to each other now in a lockdown. So I'm a pretty lucky guy, to be honest with you. I've got a good job, great family, and I find time to do this. This is something that I love on weekends.
So, further to that, Tim, you may know that there are many writers who listen to this podcast, and I ask each of my guests if they would be willing to share a top tip or three about the writing process or getting published. So, on that basis, what would yours be?
Top tip, I would say, well, I've got a few. So read, read everything, not just the genre that you're wanting to write in. I think it's important to read a lot. Find your voice. I've got, a couple of books or a book and a half in a drawer that will never see the light of day, that were really good sort of learning experiences for me in discovering what kind of writer that I could be. So I think you've just got to write, and just write and write and write to learn and figure out the type of writer you can be, finding your voice, as I said. And the other one is, don't be afraid to hit delete, because sometimes I think if you're tying yourself up in knots on some chapters that you think are almost working but not working, and if you can fiddle with that stuff forever, sometimes, just hit delete and go again, because that writing, nothing there will be wasted. You'll have some learnings from what you've written, but going sometimes afresh really can bring out the best writing in you. And plotting, I think. I love the writing process. The words come pretty easily for me. The plot I find hard, and really spending time on the plot. I am a bit of a plotter now. I come up with an idea that I think I want to do for the book, and sometimes I will just get going. But if I get going too far into a story without properly really considering the plot, where it's going, who are the key characters, and really the ending as well, if I don't know those things, sometimes I write myself into corners that I can't get out of.
You wouldn't be the only one, my friend.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fantastic. So, Tim, if listeners wanted to connect with you, how can they do that?
Through my website, timayliffe.com. Just got a feedback area there, and that sends emails directly to me, so I'll pick them up, and I always try to respond. So really happy to hear from people.
Lovely. And you're on social media?
Yes, yep. I'm on Twitter. Tim J. Ayliffe on Twitter, and they can find me on Facebook and LinkedIn as well. I'm Ayliffe Tim at Instagram.
Tim, The Enemy Within was a terrifyingly gritty read that I thoroughly enjoyed. I can't recommend it highly enough, listeners. Wishing you all the best with its impending release. Thank you for joining me on Talking Aussie Books.
Thanks so much, Claudine. It's been lovely talking to you.
Well, that's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes or drop me a line via my Instagram at Claudine Tinellis or on my webpage claudinetинellis.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, happy reading.